Welcome to the For Love and Money podcast, the show where business and social purpose meet to inspire a movement for positive change. Here's your host, Carolyn Butler-Madden.
Today's episode is recorded on Guyamigal and Garigal country, and I want to begin, as I always do, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of these lands. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples whose enduring connection to country, to language and to story continues to inspire this work. Now, episode 100, and in honour of this milestone, today the tables are being turned. I'm being interviewed, and the person doing the interviewing is someone I deeply respect. Purpose champion, trusted colleague and all-round brilliant human, Peter Weeme. Peter, over to you.
And hello, everybody. My name is Peter Weeme, and I'll be interviewing Carolyn today. And I'm joining you from Sydney, from the lands of the Eora people of the Gadigal Nation. So welcome, everybody. And I'm just going to give a little bit of an introduction on our esteemed guest who's experiencing her 100th episode of her podcast. And I'm just going to ask some questions and some learnings and some different aspects of what's happened over the last 100 episodes. But I wanted to, for those who don't know, introduce, I should say, Carolyn and a little bit about her. So Carolyn brings a 30-year career in advertising, both in the UK and Australia. 17 of those years were spent owning and running her own agency. And in about 2011, she went down what we call the purpose rabbit hole. I think she discovered purpose and just did a whole career over the course of 6 years, did a career pivot by 2017 into a focus on purpose in business. She's the author of 2 books on purpose, and she's now researching her third. And today she's really an activist for purpose-driven leadership. She's a professional speaker, she's an author, she's a consultant, advisor, a coach, a wife, a mother, and the host of For Love and Money. So, Carolyn, welcome and congratulations on your achievement.
Thank you very much, Peter. And are we going to introduce you?
Well, that's you. That's up to you.
I think we should. We haven't planned this very well, have we? But look, Peter is hosting this special episode. I was planning it, and Peter and I worked together in Purpose Ignition, and he is a purpose champion from way, 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 way back. Even to the point where the Canadian Purpose Economy Project have named a Purpose Champions Award in his honour, the Peter Weeme Purpose Champions Award, isn't it? In recognition of amazing purpose-driven leadership. And Peter's been doing this in difficult industries, challenging industries. So I'm really honoured that Peter offered to interview me for this episode, and I'm a little bit nervous because I feel like 100 episodes and there's so much rich stuff in there, and I'm petrified I'm not going to remember everything. And also, I feel like I just want to shout out to every single guest that has been on the show. But of course, we're not going to be able to do that. So anyway, let's get into it.
Okay. So Carolyn, 100 episodes. That's a pretty big milestone. And when you started For Love and Money way back when with your first episode, did you actually think that it would live this long and you would be celebrating 100 episodes?
No way. It was meant to be 12 episodes.
Oh.
The plan was I was writing my book, For Love and Money, and I remember thinking, I'm going to interview all these amazing people. I might as well do a podcast. And my daughter was working with me at the time. This was 2021. And we'd never done anything like this, and we both kind of just put our heads together, and there were amazing people along the way who helped us, telling us what we needed to do to set it up. But it was only meant to be 12 episodes, Peter. And what happened was I was interviewing amazing people. The insights that were coming through the interviews were incredible. And I just thought, I want to keep going with this. But even then, when I thought I want to keep going, I didn't anticipate it would ever get this far. It just the listenership didn't fall away. It kept growing, and the interviews were just, continuing to be really rich. So, no, really surprised that we got here. And yeah, it's incredible, and don't know where it will go in the longer term, but we're continuing.
What has really surprised you most about the journey? And that's either about the podcast itself and what you've learned from it.
I think that this word love, which is in the title of the podcast and is in the signature question that I ask every guest at the beginning, and regardless of what they answer in the beginning, and regardless of, even though some who answer positively about it, you can feel it's just not kind of what they expect. But the idea just keeps coming up again and again and again in every interview. In fact, I should do an AI search on how many times the word love comes up across the interviews, because it just comes up naturally. And I think what it shows me is it shows up as humanity in business. And what it's really clarified for me is the idea that when business is driven by a clear sense of humanity and is profitable, that is business at its absolute best. And I think that idea was kind of vaguely available to me, but it's just clarified it and surprised me in how powerfully it's come through.
So, when you talk about love in business, people probably think that's a little woo-woo. And what are you talking about? Love has no role to play in business. It's about making money and that kind of thing. So you ask every time you have one of these interviews, you say, is there a role for love in business? And why and so my question would be, why that question? And why start every interview with it?
Well, first of all, it's called the For Love and Money podcast. So, it has to appear there. But the reason that question cropped up from the beginning was because this whole idea of purpose, and I know you'll understand this, Peter, the whole idea of purpose and the word purpose in business has been completely misused and misinterpreted by so many businesses. I mean, every business out there, most businesses out there say, yeah, we've got a purpose. And yet it's not the driving force of their business. And, when we talk about purpose, we're talking about higher purpose. And for me, it was like, well, how do you simply frame it? How do you simply frame it so they understand it's not just about the why that gives context to what they already do? And to me, it came down to, well, purpose is inspired by love of people and planet. As simple as that.
Right.
It's a deep care, that kind of love. So for me, that was my purpose in answering the question. But what I found was it's opened up lots of other interpretations of love in business in the way guests have responded to it.
And what have you noticed about how they respond to it? Like, do they embrace it? Do they resist it? And then what happens at the end of the conversation? Does it just sort of, pardon my French, peter out, or does it have some, does it end with a bang, or what happens when you start having a conversation about love and business?
I love this because it's like, so as you would imagine, I invite guests who I know are purpose-driven guests, purpose-driven leaders. So the vast majority answer in the affirmative. Yes, love does have a role in business, but the way they then contextualize it is different. So, some people say, You've got to love what you do. You've got to you've got to love the people you work with. The different sort of things. But what I've noticed is that then that the concept of love just comes through and builds more strongly through the interview in different ways. So it brings to life the purpose of the people and the organizations they lead. But there was one standout example that I remember. So one of my early episodes featured Dave Dahl, who was the creator of Dave's Killer Bread, which is the USA's #1 organic bread. And I mean, his story is fascinating because he's, an ex-con who was imprisoned 4 times and he got a second chance. And yeah, he's quite a character. And he answered the question. He said something like, "Oh, I don't know, love is very complicated, and I'm not sure how to answer that." And you could see from his body language that he just thought it was too woo, and then just through the course of the interview, everything he said came back to it, came back to love. And I remember at that towards the end of the interview, just going, I can't remember what he said. Oh, he did. He said, "You got to love what you do. I love what I do, and that's what matters." And at the end of that, after saying a whole host of other similar things, I just went, "Gotcha. Let's go back to the beginning of this interview." And he kind of went, "Yeah, you're right."
Yeah. So the point being, love and business do fit together,
Yeah.
into a very compelling narrative. So let's just shift gears a little bit and move into the episodes themselves, if that's okay.
Mm.
You've grouped some of your highlights of the last 100 episodes into 3 categories, and one of them is that businesses that have proven conclusively that purpose and profit are not in tension with each other, right? That's something that you're very convinced of. So am I. What's the case that you're making, and where does the proof lie when you're having those conversations and you're trying to show that purpose and profit are not in opposition to each other? What's the proof?
Um, there's a lot of proof. So, over the course of 100 episodes, I've interviewed businesses across so many different industries, and big businesses, small, medium, micro, and some of them, when I look back, there are some that haven't made it, you know,
Right.
and but that's true of any business. The vast majority of startups don't make it in the long term. But the ones that have, I think about businesses like Intrepid Travel, who are on track to being a $1.3 billion company. I think over the next year, like they've surpassed $1 billion. Who gives a crap? And Outland Denim, they're both global brands. Future Super growing fast in a conservative industry.
Yeah.
Dave's Killer Bread. So I talked about Dave Dahl before, and that Dave's Killer Bread used to be, I can't remember the name of the family bakery, but it was his family who started this bakery in Portland, Oregon, and they grew the business. But it was only when he came on board and created this amazing organic seeded loaf using the design principles he'd learnt in a workshop in prison, design thinking principles, I should say. And that business grew over time because of A, the quality of the bread, but B, the story behind it of second chances and their support for the Second Chance Foundation, which gave criminals, ex-convicts, employment opportunities. And, they grew from a family bakery to become the US's #1 organic bread. And they sold, I think it was in 2015, to Flower Foods for $275 million US. So this idea that purpose and profit go hand in hand rather than head to head. You know, a lot of people seem to think, oh no, you know, if you dial more into purpose, then you're leaving profit behind. But the most purpose-driven organizations, and some of the best of them here on this podcast, you know, they show that it goes hand in hand. Intrepid Travel, I remember Jeff Manchester all the way back in episode 2 talking about how purpose and profit is, they see them as a package deal. So yeah, I think purpose scales, and when it scales, it gives expression to, I think, you know, the very best version of what business can look like.
So you've mentioned Intrepid a couple of times. You've had them, I think, 4 times on this podcast. What keeps bringing you back to that organization? What is it about what they do or that's interesting and has enough to it that you have the ability to have 4 different podcasts and not be repetitive?
Because they are such a complete example of purpose-driven business. They've been around for a long time. I remember my first episode 2 with Jeff Manchester, who's co-founder, and he's been so supportive of this podcast and generally of, you know, building the movement for purpose-driven business. It's in his DNA. But I remember him saying in that first in episode 2, you know, we only recently articulated our purpose statement. And I had to laugh when he said that, Peter, because I researched them, and he was almost being apologetic. And I was like, yeah, but Jeff, you've been purpose driven from the very beginning. Like, the actions you've taken reflect back on who you are and, you know, the kind of business you run. And, you know, that is what a purpose-driven business looks like, even if it didn't have a purpose statement at the time.
Right.
So there was that it was inherent in their DNA. But then as they became more aware of it and intentional about it, it really informed everything they did. You know, he talked about how years ago, when Thailand was their biggest destination and really, really profitable, and part of their offering was elephant rides. And I think animal welfare NGO, I think it was ActionAid, did some research and identified the negative impact on animal welfare.
Right.
And once they knew that, they had to make a decision. And they decided to pull, you know, that one of the most profitable parts of their business, because they said, we can't continue doing this. And they then campaigned for the travel industry to change as well. And as a result of doing it, and it goes back to one of the proof points of how purpose can drive advantage, is they became known as the elephant people. So anytime the media needed a story on the treatment of elephants, they would go to Intrepid Travel. And of course, that gave them a profile and attracted a certain kind of employee or customer or whatever it might be. Right. But there are so many examples over the years. And my last episode 99, in a really sort of nice sort of circular thing, Jeff Manchester was my first, and Sarah King, who's GM of Purpose at Intrepid, was episode 99. Again, they shared examples of doing similar things. So again, like elephant rides in Thailand, they had a very profitable tour to Antarctica. And they talked about how they measured the carbon footprint of that tour to Antarctica, and it was off the Richter scale. And they had to make a decision, and they had to balance the pros and cons, you know, and there were real pros and benefits in the educational awareness that their customers got out of, climate, global warming and the impacts of it. And they decided to pull out of Antarctica. Now, they're still in Antarctica, but they've partnered with an organization, a business that is actually running the tours much more sustainably than they were able to do. But they've pulled out of something that was highly profitable for them. And the other reason I love Intrepid as an example is profit is important to them. They are ambitious for both. So Sarah King, in the interview, she talked about how, she said, people talk about patient capital. Well, she said, when we pulled out of Antarctica, our targets weren't changed. We were told, no, you've just got to replace it and find them somewhere else. And she referred to that as impatient capital. But they offer so many examples, and their growth, even though they went back to zero during COVID, their growth has just been incredibly strong. I think they were in AFR's fast growth list 2024. They came in at number 2.
Wow.
So they're a really great example of a business that is profiting through purpose.
Now, I think one, as you said, Sarah uses that term, impatient capital, and purpose held to the same standard as financial targets. So, what does that look like in practice, though? How does that manifest itself?
If you, the best way I can answer that without going into the weeds, and also probably doing it badly, because I'm not very good at remembering all the micro detail. But the best way I can answer that is to say, go and download Intrepid Travel's integrated annual report, because it shows the balance between the two. And it also shows that with those balanced targets, and that also integrates things like B Corp certification, which is a really good way of measuring the impact that you're having with some of the other organizations that they're part of. But that's a brilliant example of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that answer the question, or did you want to get at something else there?
No. I think that's fine. And you've talked about some of your conversations with Jeff Manchester as well, and I guess the test of purpose in a company, it often gets put off to the side when things become economically challenging or what have you. So the test of purpose is really if it holds when everything else is falling apart.
Mm.
So how has Intrepid managed that? Like, did the world fall apart during COVID and other things? I mean, I know their revenues took a dive, but did they, put their purpose off to the side? Did they?
No, yeah, that's the other great thing is, look, they had to retrench a lot of people.
Yeah.
And, I remember Manch saying that was so hard. When you build an organization that is purpose-led and people-centric, to actually have to let good people go is almost impossible, but we had to.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the detail, but the way they did it, I think, reflected again who they were. And I think when they were able to hire back, they were able to hire back a lot of the people they'd let go. Whereas in a normal business, once you've been let go, you're unlikely to return to that company, are you? Because of the bad blood you'd feel. So that reflects that bad blood wasn't there. But they went down, when you say it hit them badly, they went to zero overnight, right? Zero revenue from having their, continuous growth over 4 or 5 years and having their best ever revenue. But they used purpose as their North Star during that period, that difficult period. And it led to things like, their animal welfare guide that had come from their elephant decision applied to a lot of other tours. And they then said, well, hang on, if we're going to be the best travel company for the world, which was their vision, and if we're going to create positive impact through the joy of travel, which is their purpose, then we can't just think about ourselves. We need to think about the industry. And so they started doing work around things like making that animal welfare toolkit available to anybody who wanted it, their competitors. The same went for a 10-point decarbonisation plan. So all their IP and work that, resources that they'd invested into how do we decarbonise our business, their IP, they made available to their competitors.
Right.
And I went to a conference, Force for Good, a few weeks ago, and you could see it was a travel industry conference, and you could see. So Jeff Manchester was there. He was there to introduce Philippa Durant, who's country manager of Expedia. So once again, he had been really supportive of Philippa's work in doing her executive MBA on purpose, on brands with heart. And he made the trip from Melbourne to Sydney to introduce her because she was talking about that there. And it goes to this ambition that goes far beyond us, them, Intrepid, but to this is the impact we want to have on the world. And it's not just going to be through our business, it's got to be industry wide. And you could see like the travel companies at that conference clearly had so much respect for them. Like they were really, I think, the shining stars that others were looking to emulate.
Right.
Before we dive back in, a quick word from me. If you're enjoying this conversation, you might want to know that I work with leaders and organisations on how purpose becomes a powerful driver of trust, performance, and resilience. I speak at leadership conferences and company events about how purpose shows up where it matters most, in leadership, in culture, and in strategy, helping organisations grow with clarity and confidence in a changing world. You can find out more at my website, carolynbutlermadden.com. Now, back to the episode.
So I want to switch gears into the next section, which is talking about innovation and purpose. And you make a strong claim, that purpose and sustainability are the greatest drivers of genuine innovation, right? And a lot of business leaders view purpose and sustainability as nice stuff to have on the side, but it's not the real, if they take a more Friedman-like approach to this, it's like, we're here to make as much money as we can for shareholders. That's it. That's all we care about. You make a more provocative statement saying that purpose and sustainability are the drivers of genuine innovation. So make the case. I'm skeptical. Convince me.
You're really?
Well,
no,
I'm
you're
not.
just pretending to be skeptical.
I'm pretending to be skeptical, yes.
Okay.
But
I love this. Okay. This excites me so much because I just don't understand how a lot of business leaders just don't seem to see this. So there are so many examples throughout the 100 episodes. There is, there's a really feel-good example, Good Citizens Eyewear. And that's Nick Robinson and his son, Harry Robinson, and the whole family, Joss, his wife, and the younger brother as well. They basically sat around the kitchen table talking about climate change, and it's a brilliant episode because he talks about how all of these things, how sometimes you have something on your mind and you just can't get away from it. It keeps appearing in different ways, in different forms. And he said his son had come back from school and they were talking about it at school, and I think he was really disappointed because he wanted to be a climate action monitor and he didn't get it. And they were talking about it. And then he was watching, the family were watching David Attenborough on television. And then something happened in the business he was working for. And all these things happened. And he said, it was just like, we had this conversation around the dining table and we said, well, hypothetically, if we were to do something about this, what might it look like? And he talks about how his son, Harry, who I think was 8 at the time, held up a 600 ml bottle of water and a pair of sunnies and said, well, these feel kind of similar. Could we make the glasses, using recycled bottles of water? And that's how Good Citizens was born, after 2000 and something mistaken bad attempts. But it's a brilliant story of innovation. And these glasses, everything is made from this plastic bottle, even the hinges of the eyewear, right? And they've got a beautiful story, a beautiful offering, and that's innovation. Koskela is a office furniture company. Sasha Tichkowski was my guest. She is the co-founder and CEO of Koskela. And she was talking about how they're B Corp certified. And she was talking about how, waste, like she said, offices, they turn over their office furniture and all of this stuff just goes to landfill, to waste. And they offered a pickup service. So if somebody was their client, they offered a pickup service. But she said people just weren't taking it up. And so the problem still persisted. And I've got to check to see if they got this off the ground, but they had a concept in development at the time, which she shared with me, which was an office furniture subscription model designed to solve the waste problem.
Yeah.
Right? Innovation. And she was saying there are all these other subscription models that have been applied, but it's never been applied to office furniture. And suddenly, they got the business model working, and that's innovation, and it solves a major problem. Another recent episode was with Athena Manley. So she was chief strategy officer of a big financial corporate multinational company, 2IC to the CEO, expected to step into his shoes when he stepped down. And she did all this research and decided it was not for her because she realized that CEOs died earlier, got divorced more, had health problems, were more overweight, all of these things. And she decided to look at other alternatives. And she identified this problem, or two problem areas. One, where good, experienced, older C-suite companies, C-suite level people who had, lost their job or been made redundant or stepped down, were struggling to get another role. And yet they brought so much experience to bear. And then she discovered medium-sized businesses who were struggling to attract good quality CEOs. And often they were then hiring CEOs who weren't particularly good quality, and it wasn't working out. And she's provided this bridge and a supporting structure to that. That's innovation, right? She's not a recruitment company. Her business is the flexible CEO. It's a bridge, and it's working really, really well. Can I give you two more examples? Because I just think this is such a powerful product of purpose. Danielle Owen Whitford, I can't remember the episode number, but she is the founder and CEO of Pioneera. So she worked for a big corporate C-suite, and she burnt out. 100% burnt out, overworked, nobody picked it up, and like a big burnout breakdown. And as she had to step away, and as she contemplated, she was thinking, how did I not recognize what was going on? How did nobody around me see what was going on? Couldn't this have been prevented? And I think she said she was looking at her emails and things like that, and she said, you could see it in my correspondence. If you looked, you could see that it was there. And she came up with this idea that language can be visible evidence of, someone approaching burnout. And so she created Pioneerer, which is an AI-driven language model that workplaces can attach to their communication platforms like Slack and Teams and things like that, to then help identify when people are approaching burnout and manage that as well.
Right.
Innovation, right? And there is just example after example. Elizabeth Tyler of Good Dot Film, she set out to solve a problem, which was seeing the world become more and more divided and combative. We're all in our camps and we're being manipulated to stay in those camps, rather than having curiosity and trying to understand each other. And she was looking at, what is a business? What is a vehicle that could change that? And she landed on films. So Good Dot Film basically is a platform where, if you care about causes or society generally, you can find different films that tackle complicated issues. So what's the one I just saw? I went to a premiere recently. Life Could Be a Dream. Life Could Be a Dream tackles domestic violence, but it's more about coercive control. And it's a really complex subject, right? And yet you could see, how you can actually see things that you might not have seen before. So anyway, there's so many examples of, innovation as a brilliant expression of purpose and how that becomes a defining point of difference that elevates the organization and the brand.
So is there a story or a line or something that a guest said that has genuinely stayed with you that's in this innovation category?
A story or a line. There are so many. I mean, the stories, I've just shared a whole stack with you.
Yeah.
So a more recent episode, Robin Power, he was a engineer, but he wasn't a civil engineer. He was one of the other engineers. I can't remember which, but his company, it fell over, and he said it was just, really, really hard, like it is, for any business, because he let down investors and employees and all of this. And as he was contemplating the future, he, he came across this stat, which was that civil engineering touches 70% of Australia's emissions. 70% of Australia's full emissions are attached, or civil engineering is connected to it.
Right.
And it made him realize that, whatever he did next, he wanted it to have a positive impact on business. So he's created In Situ Tech, which is a civil engineering company, but also Ground Zero, I think it is, which is, I think it's a non-profit organization attached to it, but which is there to basically help the industry by showing how innovation can drive solutions to the world's problems.
Right.
And just that story, it parallels some other stories, including yours, Peter, which is, and this is something else that came through that surprised me. You asked me what surprised me before, and this is something else that really surprised me. That people like you, people like Robin, And there are a whole group of people like Danielle Owen Whitford, who I just talked about, from their pain, from their, struggle, what they have been smashed by, they come out of it wanting to help others,
Right.
not be smashed by it. And that's something that I just think, again, it goes back to that humanity in business, I think is so, I'm going to say this word, but it's so precious, right? But like, and this is the opportunity for me
Yeah.
is, when people, you through your illness, how you've showed up has been incredible. Like, telling people, sharing with people what you're going through, but using it to actually tell people to think about what's really important in their lives.
Yeah.
And that's what makes us that's what makes people incredible. And it's the same thing that makes businesses incredible, because it's people who build businesses.
So I'm conscious of moving on because we only have a certain amount of time. We've and you've, I think, underscored the fact that purpose is deeply personal, and everybody has their own story or their own connection to it, and so on. When you think of the dozens of guests that you've had, um, or which ones come to mind when you think about purpose that's most deeply and unmistakably personal? What are the stories that capture it best? Give a couple of, I mean, everything in this conversation is about purpose and how different people approach it. But what are a couple of examples that you would say was uh, outside of me where it's been deeply personal, and what captures it best?
Yeah, yeah. And there are so many. It's interwoven throughout. Sandy Blackburn, episode 18, episode 89. I wrote this one down. So she spent 15 years in South Africa, between 1988 to 2003. She lived in townships. She married into a Black South African family, and she wrote a book which was incredible. She gave me a copy of it, and it just blew me away. And she talks about the idea of Ubuntu, which I'm sure a lot of listeners know about, that whole thing of I am because we are, as an antidote to Western individualism, right?
Yeah.
And she talked in the episode about, money. I think this was in answer to the question, does love have a role in business? And she flipped it and she said, money is a way to buy yourself space to love.
Right.
You don't have to wait until you retire. But so she, her experience has come through, and she went to work for Westpac, and she could have a very high powered job, and she basically, has an organization where she is trying to help nonprofits to track their impact and to embed culture so that, they can optimize their impact. But yeah, it comes from who she is. And that's deep, that comes through deeply in the episode. Another one is, Simon Shake, episode 4, I think, Future Super, CEO and co-founder of Future Super. He talked at one point about, and so this would have been 2021 when we did the interview, and he said in 2035, 2050, my son will be 35. What's the world going to look like then? I can't just sit on my hands. So he created Future Super. Clearly he is an activist at heart, but it was that, personal love for his son that made him think about, what can I do to move the dial, move the needle? And then Peter Baines, episode 91. So he's founder of Hands Across the Water. And yeah, again, he wrote a book that I read that was incredible. But his background as he was a forensic investigator, and he was sent to Bali after the Bali bombings. And then it took him, because of the work he did there, it took him all around the world, and eventually landed him in Thailand after the Boxing Day tsunami. And, what he saw there, he couldn't walk past. And actually, that's something I saw over and over and over again. Outland Denim, James Bartle, he was a motocross rider, a champion motocross rider. And he saw the film Taken, the film with Liam Neeson.
Yep. Yep.
And he couldn't believe it, that, sex trafficking was still a thing. And then he was invited to Cambodia. And while he was in Cambodia, he saw it firsthand. And he said, I just couldn't not do anything. And he started Outland Denim, a fashion brand, right? He's a motocross rider, and he starts a fashion brand because he said, I could not walk past this. And that just, it shows up over and over and over again. That personal nature of, this is who I am. I can't not do anything.
So I think you've mentioned Desmond Campbell, and he was one of your guests as well. And he introduced himself in in the podcast that he was on, in his own language before the interview began. And I'm just curious, like, what was that like for you to see that being, authentically shared with viewers? Because many times, welcome to country, or acknowledgement of country, I should say, is performative, right? A lot of organizations just gloss over it very quickly. But here's somebody who actually introduced himself in his language and literally put a stake in the ground. So what was that like?
It was really emotional, actually. He introduced himself, and he asked if he could do this, but he introduced himself in his own language. He talked about his mother's side background, and then his father's side. And he then talked about there's something he said that just gave me just chills. And it was like, he said, he was talking about his background and just, some of the challenges. And he said, for a moment, I was almost convinced that I came from nothing, that I was nothing. And then he discovered that, the song, the Paul Kelly song, From Little Things, Big Things Grow.
Yeah.
That song is about Vincent Lingiari, and it talks about the Wave Hill walk-off and the return of the land. And his father told him, this is your great-great-grandfather. And he was like, no, I didn't. And he dived into it. And, he started asking questions of elders, and finding the thread back to who he was. And then everything changed for him. And it's kind of like that episode top and tail so emotively, because at the end, when I asked him to share his dream of what the world could look like in 2030, I can't remember exactly, but he spoke of Aboriginal people being celebrated and having pride and having sports halls named after them and streets named after them, and people recognizing the richness of their culture.
Yeah.
And it was just, it took me straight back to that opening. And when he said, I was almost convinced I came from nothing, and then this discovery. And yeah, it it reinforced my belief that identity is everything. Identity, if your purpose isn't connected to who you are, I'd question whether it's really a genuine purpose.
Yeah. So we just have a few minutes left. I just wanted to ask you a couple final questions, if I could, about the next chapter. And you've done now 100 episodes. Once again, congratulations. And there are dozens of extraordinary leaders that have been part of these conversations. What's the single thing that you want listeners today to take away from this episode and the experiences that you had that led you up to this episode?
The one thing that everything goes back to is that purpose isn't powerful until it's personal.
Right.
And, I talked a little bit about it with Desmond, but it runs through every single episode. Some don't go into it as deeply, like they gloss over it, but it's there. You can see it, right? It's almost like I want to do a follow-up with everybody and give them that space to go deep into their background and why this is important to them. But the number of organizations, so I know a lot of listeners who listen to the podcast are trying to navigate their way through purpose, are trying to bring it from the silos of the business into the center and the heart of the business. And and many of them are struggling with connecting their people to purpose. And this idea that purpose isn't powerful until it's personal is so relevant to, that's how you've got to make it personal. It's the job of the CEO and leaders to make sure it is personal to every single person in the company, because it's only when you do that that you are actually going to build that energy that actually can drive innovation, drive resilience and resourcefulness and agility and all those things that companies want from people.
Yeah.
To make the business successful.
Yeah, and I think every individual should be thinking about their own personal purpose and how that ladders up to the company or the organizational purpose that they're a part of, because there needs to be some kind of connection so that you can then be more inspired and lean right in to that purpose, right? And know
Yeah,
how your actions and your own purpose relates to that, right?
100%, 100%. And this opens a door to storytelling, and yeah, and the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, which are the most powerful stories of all. If you can unlock that in your people, that changes everything. That dynamic changes everything, and you could see it in some of the larger companies who have, you know, actually scaled through purpose. You can see it living in them.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and by the way, good senior managers or executives are storytellers, or first and foremost, they should help bring people along, help them understand the why, the how, and so on. So there's a very important lesson there. But the last question, I guess, that I would like to ask you is, we're doing this session. Hopefully, you're going to take a little bit of a break and then think about the next episode, number 101, and that will open a new chapter. So, what does that chapter look like, and what kind of questions will drive it?
Cool. I've already recorded 3.
Oh,
So yeah, it look, it will continue to explore the intersection of purpose and profit. But what I do want to do is create space to go deeper into the guest's personal purpose, their story that brought them there.
right.
Because I honestly think that that is a game changer in terms of how people see purpose. And it connects that idea of, you know, why you exist is because of who you are,
Yeah.
Individually, but also as an organization. What is that unique identity? The identity that's unique to your organization that becomes your secret sauce. And that, when it's connected to your why, builds shared narrative amongst your people, your teams, your employees, but also amongst your customers or clients and your partners. That's the most powerful version of it. And then it inspires what you do. And, once what you do is a reflection of who you are and why you exist, what you do becomes stories, not marketing stories, but stories that people tell of this is who we are. Look, this is what my manager, this is how my manager responded to this situation. This is an initiative that so-and-so created. These are all stories which are evidence of purpose and identity in action. And that's the piece I want to explore, which is connected to the next book.
Okay. Well, good luck with all of that. I mean, we could still spend time talking about
I know.
other guests that you've had or topics or learnings and what have you, but today is a bit of a taster for those who maybe haven't had the opportunity to listen to some of the other episodes. But I think I'd like to acknowledge the work that you've done, the way that you've brought these conversations from the margins to the middle, more into the mainstream. I think there's a lot of misinformation about what purpose is, and there's purpose washing and a whole bunch of things. And the more that I think you have these conversations, the more that you talk about how people came to where they are in their purpose journey, what some of the challenges are. It's not all flowers and pretty birds and butterflies. Like, there's a lot of hard work that goes into this, and there's a lot of learning that comes from what doesn't work as well as what does. So on behalf of anybody listening today, I'd like to say thank you to you for the work that you're doing, and looking forward to episode 101. So get busy.
Get busy. Thank you, Peter. And thank you for turning the tables on me. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the For Love and Money podcast. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into the purpose movement, visit us at thecauseeffect.com.au. And remember, doing good is good for business. So if you're not doing good, then what are you doing?